Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for being here. I'm Erin Baker. I'm a visiting fellow here at New America. And today I'd like to, introduce our panelists, but I'll give you a bit of an overview. Global agreements and national strategies may set the framework for the energy transition, but the implementation occurs within local communities. So this panel is going to delve into how local leadership is driving a clean energy initiatives, often navigating limited resources, but possessing a profound understanding of on-the-ground realities. The discussion will highlight the roles of local governments, civil society, and community-based organizations in overcoming challenges related to the clean energy transition deployment, as well as critical mineral extraction and inclusive climate politics. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have in the middle Ken Opalo, who's a senior fellow also at Planetary Politics, and he's associate professor at Georgetown University in the School of Foreign Service. And we have Claude Kabemba, did I say that correctly?
Yes.
Okay, who's the CEO of Southern Africa Resource Watch, which is a leading African think tank on resource governance. And he has about 27 years of experience in the sector, so good background. And then we have Tom Cormans, who's the executive director of Appalachian Voices, a civil society organization that brings together people to protect the land, air, and water of central and southern Appalachia while advancing a just transition to a generative and equitable clean energy economy. So I think I'd like to start with you, Tom. Because mostly yesterday we were talking about a just energy transition in the context of the global south. And we overlooked the fact that we also have these issues in the global north as well. And as somebody who is coming from a community that has been mined for, I would say, centuries maybe at this point?
A good century.
A century. I'd like to hear a little bit more on how your organization looks at what a clean, green energy transition looks like and what kind of solutions that your organization has been helping to implement to make it more just and more clean.
Absolutely, thank you. And really happy to be here with all of you on the panel today. My organization works in 5 central Appalachian states, all of which have been heavily impacted by the extractive economy you just mentioned for the past century or so. We have about 50 employees throughout the region in 4 offices and in other locations where they can be very close to the work on the ground. And in addition to working to address the impacts of mining and extraction and combustion of fossil fuels, we devote a lot of our energy, really the majority of our energy organizationally, to the energy and economic solutions side for economic reasons that may have been discussed yesterday and we could go into. We're definitely at a point where the Appalachian region is shifting rapidly, has rapidly shifted away from a point where it can be dependent on what was largely a coal mono economy. And so across the political spectrum, there has been a real concerted, bipartisan, all hands on deck effort to figure out what a healthy, diversified economy in the region looks like and to build that together. And Appalachian Voices has been committed to being a part of that and helping to advance clean energy solutions that create jobs and local benefits and reduce energy burden and energy bills on the ground. Also other areas that are sort of outside the scope for today, but mine land reclamation that takes essentially these stranded assets and liabilities and works to develop them into, it might be a workforce training center, it might be a campground related to a trail system and tourism. And on the clean energy side, what we have seen in this historically energy producing region of the country, based on beginning with a very open dialogue and conversation, convening stakeholders to come together and talk about the next couple of years, to talk about the future together. What we've seen emerge is a lot of enthusiasm around clean energy as one of those key economic drivers for the future. And I'll say here, and I can expound on this later in the panel, but the process of bringing people together across categories of local stakeholders, local government, entrepreneurs, community leaders, and bringing in resources like my organization that work on how to navigate things like government funding streams, some philanthropic funding streams, the clean energy tax credits. That's the kind of room in which real solutions, like how are we practically going to move this forward, can emerge. I think the really important thing is what I think has been proven not to work very well is sort of a top-down outside entity coming into community that hasn't put down roots, that doesn't have local roots, saying this is the path forward, kind of our way or the highway, as opposed to it being a generative from the ground up process that is aided and supported by civil society, by government at the state level, the federal level, and the local level, and that's when you see that positive traction.
So diversifying, but doing it from the ground up, not top down. That makes sense. Claude, this is something that you have talked about and you've seen a lot in the South African context, where communities are taking the transition by the reins or tackling mining themselves. Do you want to talk a little about what you're seeing in terms of community activism in South Africa? And I think you had a story yesterday about one community in the Eastern Cape as well that I thought was an interesting example.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. I think the model Tom uses to do the work, it's similar to our model, where we are a regional organization with offices in some countries and working through network. So I'll speak to many communities. I've had a chance to visit a number of communities affected by mining companies across the African continent. I think mining has been very brutal on people. And that has been so for centuries. Solutions, both national solutions and international solutions, have not solved people's grievances. So we are in a position where people are crying and they see the energy transition as an opportunity to change the current model, where they've been marginalized, where they've not benefited to the maximum from the extraction of the minerals under their feet. So when we say 900 million people do not have access to energy, when you go deeper and start to identify these communities, you find that most of these communities are mining communities surrounded by mining. These are the poorest communities on the African continent, marginalized, despite the fact that they bear the impact of mining, the negative impact of mining. The community that you are talking about, the Kolobela community in South Africa, is a community that has lived for all the years, for centuries, through agriculture, through tourism, through fisheries. And suddenly there is an Australian mining company that comes which says we want to extract, I think, heavy sand. And the government sign and give a permit to extract. The community says, we are not going to allow that to happen to our land. And the reason, not because they did the evaluation, but they've seen what mining has done to other communities. And they think that it's not worth it to go through mining. So they stood against the Australian company. They stood against government. They went to court, and they won. They won not because government was weak or the company was weak because they put all the resources. They won because of the resilience and the leadership in that community. Few activists died. A number of them were threatened with serious death threats, but they stood. And one of the leading person, a woman, which really start to elevate women leadership and women suffering in the condition of mining. Because of that, when you speak to that lady today, she is the most outspoken, well-articulated on issues concerning mining and communities. But the question linked to that is the fact that the opportunity that the energy transition brings, first of all, in the context of these communities we are talking about, there's more the issue of access than of transition. I think it has to be clear that the community where we work, they want access to energy. There is no transiting to anything. And that starts to say the access to energy where we sit is not just access to light. We are looking at energy that transforms the lives of people. So we are talking about structural economic transformation. We are not, it's not the opportunity this community sees in the energy transition is that they will not be marginalized. They will be at the center of deciding the model, their economic model. The case of South Africa is again telling there are coal power that needs to be decommissioned. But you cannot decommission a coal power or close a coal mines from a community that has survived on those economic activities for 100 years. Despite that we have all understand the impact of coal on climate change, on carbon emission, but there is life of people who have depended on that. Now, how do you transform, how do you pivot from a high carbon economy to a zero carbon economy by not bringing people at the center of discussion to find what alternative model that will fit their lives? So it's that that discourse. And the narrative that we hear from Tom Case, from our work, a narrative does not take place in the vacuum. It takes place with facts. It's the facts, the life of people, the way they live, that create a narrative. So sometimes what I've come to get across when we discuss is that when you read the paper that was presented on Indonesia yesterday, so you start to get grabbed to the facts, and those factors start to create the narrative. And when the narrative is based on facts, you become more stronger, more resilient, and able to fight back. And in this particular case, those are the facts that we work to bring evidence and provide that evidence, put them in the hands of communities so that they can fight their own battles.
So we're talking about two things here, the research, the reporting, the facts, as you pointed out, but also like the ground voices, the people that are most directly impacted, either with the transition or with the impacts on their local community. This example aside, we often see examples of how a local community's fight to protect their environment or their labor rights, it can be portrayed as resistance to the national goals of greater economic growth or as anti-green transition. What are ways to ensure that the local actors influence and overcome that debate in order to focus on their needs rather than being seen as obstructors? How do we manage that part of the transition?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the panel. I think that's a big challenge for the transition, because we tend to have narratives at different stages, right? Just as Claude was alluding to, right? The idea that, globally we talk about energy transitions, while, the people who still don't have access, right? So that's step one. So there are people out there for whom, even the climate discourse itself, right, is alien to their objective realities, right? And then that's at the global level. At the local level, I think national development strategies often ignore local realities. So there's a good example of a potential coal power plant that eventually got nixed in Kenya. Some of you may know Lamu Island. There were geniuses who wanted to build a coal power plant close to Lamu, which is this, a very biodiverse place, beautiful island, doesn't have any cars on it. You should visit, is what I'm trying to get at here. But eventually, right, what happened is environmental groups were able to exploit environmental laws in Kenya to stall the project. And they stalled it long enough that the people behind the project eventually just gave up, right? And so that could be a potential strategy of empowering people to, again, use their own localized claims to the land, to their livelihoods, and then help them leverage national systems like the courts to at least stall some of these projects. But doing so also requires realizing that the tensions at the different levels, right? At the local level, it's a question of, livelihoods, energy access, often, regardless of what type of energy it is, right? If you don't have electricity access, you will not be picking and choosing whether the power comes from a coal plant or a hydro plant, right? You want electricity, you want, clean cooking fuel, etc. So we need to be able to have that discourse at that level and not talk past people about the need for the energy transition. Then at the national level, right, most national governments talk the language of development, right? So the Kenyan government's pitch regarding the Lamu coal power plant was we'll have lots of energy along the coast, so you can locate industrial production for export close to the port, and that will generate development. So that local communities then get seen as obstructors to the national development strategy, right? Forget that, in many cases, right, there are lots of cases of communities next to hydropower plants that don't have access to power, or increasingly solar power plants in northeastern Kenya, for example, where, the images are really stark of, desperately poor communities next to this gleaming, solar plants, and they don't have access to the power, right? So we also need to find ways to sort of, seed the right kinds of discourse when it comes to how national governments think about their development strategies vis-a-vis local communities. And then finally, at the global level, right, we also need to be aware that not everyone has been, using dirty coal for a century and therefore needs transition out of dirty coal, right? many low-income countries are actually pretty green on their grids, right? 70% hydro in many cases. And so, when say, West Virginia or a US policymaker is pitching a Kenyan policymaker, Kenya has a pretty green grid, hydro and geothermal, right? The language shouldn't be necessarily one of, reducing emissions, right? The pitch there should be about expanding access, but in a green way, right? So that it's not, the narrative isn't one of, we're going to stall or slow down your development trajectory. We're going to help you beef up your current grid and increase access. Because from the perspective of politicians in these countries, the biggest problem is still access, right? Both, just new access, but also reliable access and affordable access. Those are the things that keep them up at night. Often you see them playing the game of talking the global talk when they're at, conferences and all, and talking a completely different talk when, they're back in country. Because they know that back in country, it's, yes, they may talk about climate change when talking to their own NGOs and when they know that global funders are watching. But they know that where the rubber meets the road, the politics is still one of access, affordability, and reliability. And so we need to be aware of these multiple layers of challenges and opportunities.
Yeah, there's a real need to have better communication between the different levels. I mean, Tom, you've worked on this quite a bit. I'd like to hear your thoughts on what, in your context, constitutes meaningful community engagement, and then perhaps afterwards we can talk about the other contexts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I could cite a few different examples, and I'll also say, in listening to my colleagues on the panel speak, I think it's important to underscore that meaningful community engagement can advance two essential, parallel, complementary types of progress. One is on the policy level to enable healthy, sustainable clean energy development at the local level, and then at the implementation level to actually move that forward and make it happen. So an example I'll cite is in Southwest Virginia, where my organization, Appalachian Voices, and the local branch of the University of Virginia at WISE and People Incorporated, which is a community action agency, worked together to convene a solar working group for Southwest Virginia that pulled in localities, local entrepreneurs, planning district commissions, engaged closely with the solar industry. But that effort actually was not step one. That came out of listening sessions that we convened across the Southwest Virginia region about, essentially what people would like to see. It was come one, come all, open invitation. We put up flyers, announced it in local papers. What do you see as the future, right? And so what emerged from that, among other things, and everything that emerged was very generative and positive. One of the things that emerged was this interest in clean energy that provided the impetus to put together this solar work group that then began to make plans around aggregating local projects on community buildings, public buildings. The public school system was very involved, and in parallel with advancing those plans together, we were also supporting legislation at the Virginia legislature, the General Assembly, to raise the ceiling on power purchase agreements, which essentially is the ability for entities to operate outside of the vertically integrated monopoly framework to generate and sell power. Because in a lot of the U.S. and certainly the Southeast, we have vertically integrated monopolies that we need to sort of work with or carve out space within to advance community beneficial projects. So we were able to, after a couple of years, get that really significant win at the state legislative level that then opened the door to projects actually moving forward on the ground. So there are 13, for example, 13 local schools in the heart of Southwest Virginia coal country that are really proud to be powered by solar on their roofs now. Working with the local community college there, we worked to establish a workforce accelerator, a solar accelerator program to allow apprentices from the high schools and from the community college to be on those roofs learning solar installation, getting paid to do it. And this is a locally led crew of local solar installers plus apprentices. And I think that's the kind of arrangement where the local benefits just become just so undeniably tangible that what you begin to see is a positive feedback loop where the benefits are experienced, that generates additional interest in those types of projects, that fuels the policy that's needed to advance those projects at both the state level and the federal level, because the other thing that we, and working together with organizations across the country, were able to do, but with a lot of input from the ground. We successfully saw legislation in the form of the Inflation Reduction Act that targeted a bonus adder in the clean energy tax credits for energy transition communities. And the sort of curve of development of good projects and good projects entering the planning stage just had a major positive inflection point once those tax credits and the bonus adder, tax credits were extended, the bonus adder was added. Once that became clear and that legislation was passed, that was just a tremendous shot in the arm. So, there again, it's the multi-level. We're working locally with government, locally with communities, work locally with entrepreneurs, educate the higher ed system, and then at the policy reforms at the state level, policy incentives at the federal level, and that's how we've seen that sort of flywheel effect, I think, of continuing to build momentum, and we're really hoping that we can keep that momentum going and keep on pace with further clean energy development in the region.
Yeah, which will be essential going forward for the
Absolutely.
region. No, I mean, that's in the case, this is the context of transitioning away from coal and into something that already exists or potentially will exist on the grid. It's saving jobs. Now, what about when we go into actually mining for critical minerals, which is going to be a slightly different context? What do we need to put in place to ensure that the local communities where these resources are do not repeat the history of the old history of mining in the global south? Do you want to?
Yeah,
It could be both of you guys.
I can talk to you briefly and
Then we'll go to Claude. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think one is we should think of what sorts of jobs, right, or opportunities can we realistically provide for communities around the critical mines, right? So I think beyond making sure that we do the best we can on the environmental protection side, we should also think proactively about what can be built to enable communities. Because I think here, those of us who want to do good in this sector, right, often we have a PR problem because we tend to oppose the bad things without pitching a positive agenda to complement the oppositionist agenda. And I think this, the example that Tom just provided is a good example of what a positive agenda can do in creating sort of self-reinforcing effects. And so, in addition to the environmental protection side, I think the best we can do is make sure that we do infrastructure development that promotes non-mining economic activities, right, among the communities. So, things like road and water and power, right, should be a bare minimum around mining communities, right? It shouldn't be the case that, multi-billion-dollar mining projects, right, get away with the standard CSR sort of games that mining companies play, and then are allowed to move on. I think at a minimum, water, power, transportation infrastructure, support for local schools, et cetera, training, because we should also, we shouldn't buy into the narrative that mining will create jobs, right? Several years ago, I did a consultancy for a mining project in West Africa, and mining operations require very little in terms of human input, right? Big machines, lots is automated after the digging. So the promise of jobs is often an empty promise, right? The expertise is not there, the numbers just don't add up. So it has to be a non-mining sort of economic agenda backed by tangible investments, right? They have to be visible, tangible investments so that communities buy in. Because the other thing that I notice in this context is that once the conversation has been poisoned, right? It's often very difficult to get back to a good place because the community gets almost reflexively oppositionist, right? National elites then get in the mode of cutting corners. Mining companies exploit that division. And before you know it, right, the setup is one of people being bought off as opposed to having a nicely structured approach to the problem where everyone is at the table and people accept what costs they're willing to bear to host the mining activity, right? Because I think that's where we should get to, whereby communities and most communities, when engaged, right, can be very reasonable about these projects, right? When everyone is clear about what costs are to be borne and how they will be compensated for those costs, then you can see a structured sort of engagement. But absent that, you get a lot of cutting corners, and that's when we get the standard stories that we're all familiar with.
Claude, where do you see the line, or sorry, forgive me. When we don't want to see the sacrifices that the community in the Eastern Cape made in order to get their voices heard, we need to have a better mechanism so the voices can be heard early on in the process before it becomes antagonistic. So how do we bridge that gap there? What is the best way to strengthen the voices of the community so that it's heard at the national and at the contracting or mining agreement level?
I just want to appropriate Ken's comments and add something that, and in response to that question, there's certain values that need to guide how mining is done. And those values are the values that we all aspire to and we aspire to communicate. One is that the entire energy transition needs to be democratic. It means people needs to be brought at the center of deciding and engaging. It has to be related to inclusion. People, all group of people needs to be included. And it has to resolve social problems of people. Now, mining is a long-term business. The planning of mining and the planning of how you deal with community start at the beginning, at the conception of the mine. It does not start when you go and do your environmental assessment. And those type of things are embedded in a national regulation and laws and laws. And when the laws and regulations are clear, they also guide the potential investor how he should conduct its business. When you go to China, you don't negotiate contracts. They give you a book of regulation. They say, this is what we want from you. You take it or you leave it. You comply. In our case, we have very progressive laws and regulations that can protect people, but very seldom we enforce them. So there is a gap between policy and enforcement. And companies take advantage of that. That's why sometimes when I hear a critique around Chinese companies behaving so badly on the African continent, but you find Chinese companies, whether in manufacturing or in infrastructure, road building in Europe or in whatever it is, or semiconductors in the United States, but you find that they are behaving according to the countries of that, to the laws of that country, and they behave so well. So the difference is about the capacity of government to enforce, first and foremost, its own regulation. So communities need to be protected by the state. It's the state's responsibility to protect people. When you see people trying to protect themselves, then you must understand that the state is failing. So that's why there is a lot of work that we invest in building the capacity of communities to engage, to protect themselves and so on, because we are in the presence of most of the time failing states. So that's a big chunk of work but beyond that, I think because you are in those type of situations, then you need to listen to communities. And I hear Tom spoke about listening work you did, something like that. I think that's the most important thing. I was so happy to hear that. You need to listen to people's problems and to people's what they want. Sometimes you assume because these are rural people, they don't know. I think it's a mistake. That's why you see even researchers from Oxford, MIT, they go to villages to understand how society works. What they write in books is not their ideas. It's ideas they collected from these people, which they turn in good English and articulation. It's as simple as that. So we need to listen to the people. They have solutions, a lot of solutions. They've been protecting forests, they've been protecting their land, they've been protecting their fisheries, they've been protecting a lot of things. So listening is important. Third is that you need to consult continuously with people. Consultation should not be a one-off, either when you are doing an assessment or when you are doing mining. You need to continuously consult. And that becomes an education that we need to give to businesses. And here it's not just foreign, but also in our case, state companies. They don't act better than others. They just act in the same way. And that's to demonstrate how big a problem we have. It's not just about foreign companies, but our own state companies are not better off. The last point which builds all this is we need to enforce free, prior, and informed consent. And that has got, each word, it's got its own significance, very deep, very relevant. But what it simply means is that people can agree or not agree. But most of the time, what we've seen, people do not want to reject mining. Because mining, just as Ken has put it quite correctly, can change the livelihood of people, can create jobs, can create a better economy and so on when you do it well. But you need to give the people the opportunity to decide on what they want to do with their land.
So continuous engagement, informed consent, communication essentially. What I would like to do is maybe start communicating with you guys. If any of you have questions to present to the panel before we conclude this section.
And Aaron,
yeah.
as we're waiting on the question, if I could piggyback on a point made here, I think part of the people that we should talk to are the policymakers and the politicians, right? Often they're the villains in this story, and that we know, but we should also try to understand where they're coming from. Because, you know, in my experiences in Liberia, Guinea, and Mozambique, you know, especially Mozambique, you know, Mozambique had one case of the government basically had to rely on mining companies, geologists, and experts to write their own policy, right? You know, the incentives were completely off. And so, you know, such a government is basically, you know, totally captured from the get-go. And so sometimes we need to understand where they're coming from and think of ways that perhaps we can help them be able to stand on their own feet vis-a-vis the companies.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for this really helpful panel. And Ken, maybe my question is going to build on the point that you were just making about policymakers. So I completely agree that engagement is incredibly important. But I think that oftentimes in conversations, we talk about engagement, but we don't actually talk about how. And that becomes really important because there's big questions about who is at the table, who decides who gets to be at the table. When you have competing voices at the table, how do companies navigate that? How do governments navigate that? How is that communicated back to the communities that are being engaged? And so I think we have kind of the first step that engagement is important, but we don't quite have the effective follow-through that has demonstrated that that engagement was actually meaningful. I think oftentimes, you know, even companies do try and bring people to the table and communities together, but then there's a critique that it wasn't the right people. And so how to kind of navigate that, the who and then the follow-through from those engagements. So if you have any insights or lessons learned from your experience, I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, you know, quickly, I think Ghana, back when Ghana had initially discovered oil, provides a good template here. Even though, you know, the process didn't work out as well as, you know, most had anticipated. But I think the Ghanaian example, you know, the best thing that I saw out of it, and which has been applied to some extent in Uganda, is just having a process, like a well laid out process that everyone is aware of, so that, you know, we tie our hands with the process, understanding that, you know, every stage has politics. Even communities have politics, right? Because, you know, communities are not just kumbaya units, right? Even communities have politics. So if we have, you know, a process that everyone gets, you know, pushed through, then we can legitimize the outcomes of the processes, but also be aware that, you know, the outcomes may not be as just as we want, and so there's always room for continuous engagement and improvement. But I think having processes at the beginning and clear processes at that is a good way to legitimize the ongoing engagement process.
I think that's an important question and I think you face it every time. And I agree with you and Ken that communities, or a community is not a cohesive group of people. There are interests, there are tensions, but from the company perspective, is the way sometimes they design their consultation process. Also, we're just finishing an evaluation of the ICMM company's grievance redress mechanism. We found that is a very top-down, where the company design, then bring communities in. But also on how they select communities, it's a little bit, they don't have a more open understanding of the community and bring in. That's a big one. We have been suggesting that if it's possible to give communities to drive the consultation instead of the company, but the company becomes part of it. You remember that this consultation, they also have, you need to create sustainable structures that evolve over time and mature. As Ken said, they have problems. Just as any system, it matures through resolving challenges and problems. And we think that with a strong support from companies in a community, to allow community itself to lead that grievance redress mechanism, is a far more stronger, sustainable approach than a top-down one. Most of the time also these structures, they don't function well because you need to fund them. You need to find resources. I'll give you an example of, we are talking about pollution. That's something I raised with our colleague from Indonesia, that you have tabled a number of problems, but there's no evidence. How do you support that with evidence? That's the only time such a research starts to become credible. He gave a very good response, but in this particular case, what I'm saying, to give evidence, you need resources to go and do these things. So, and communities can observe, can see that our land has changed. We don't get enough tomatoes as we were getting 5 years ago. We don't have, our boats are not full of fish as we did. So they can, a logic deduction that it's because of this new activity. But companies don't accept that. We have a case in the Democratic Republic of Congo where a Chinese company put up a factory to produce, I think acid. Then increasingly they had problems with communities' health, the skin and so on. So the community contacted us to say, look, we have a problem here. And we had engaged with the Chinese company for, it was an American company. It was Fresh Dot, which was, it's Tenke Fungurume. They sold to the Chinese. We engaged the Americans before they sold to the Chinese. And when the Chinese came, we maintained that relations. And they agreed. And we continue up to date to engage. CIMOC is the biggest Chinese company. So in this particular case, the Chinese refused. They say, we have taken the test to a laboratory in London. There is no connection. That's rush might be problem of the cleanness. Maybe it's a problem of, you know. So then we brought in, we agreed with it. The community said, we don't want the London laboratory. can you do it differently? So we brought the University of Lubumbashi laboratory, we brought the national laboratory, and we brought a private laboratory. 3. The private one did not give the result. We don't know why. We suspect that they might have... But the university and the national laboratory, they gave the result. The results show that there might be. They did not say, you see how they wrote the analysis. They say it shows that there's an external effect on water, on vegetables that can cause this. But they don't just say this is it. So we present to the chain, they say no, there is no, they don't say this is it. We go to a doctor, he say, yeah, it's that thing that created that. So they refused, but with the provincial government, the solution was taken that the community must be displaced, must be moved from there. So that was the solution. They agreed, but they said, we are not agreeing because we recognize we are doing for humanitarian reasons. Because people have died, people are sick. When you agree that, so you need to compensate all those things. So I give that simply to show that these communities did not have evidence, but they knew that their life have changed.
So it's strengthening the fact-finding side of the communities, and that means resources. Before we go to another question, I would just, Tom, do you want to add to that point of?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's such a foundationally important question. I think, actually, earlier, Claude spoke to, I think, 3 principles that are the, should be the philosophical foundation for answering that question, which are democracy, right? I mean, ultimately, there needs to be democratic decision-making, inclusion in the process, and speaking to what people impacted on the ground actually need, what assets, what benefits they need. And in terms of operationalizing that, though, which I think is where your question is going, like what does it actually look like? It's deep work, right? In terms of who's in the room, it's got to start with all come. You know, you're a member of this community. The door to the conversation is open. And you know, we also spoke earlier about working at different levels of decision making in government, and so I think that you know, if you have a broad base of support, and it may be in some cases it's not going to be a consensus, maybe it's not going to be unanimous, but you know, if democracy is functioning the way we are all working to ensure that it does, well, you know, that broad base of support is then reflected by the local members of the Board of Supervisors, or the mayor, the state representative, et cetera. And so, you know, the permitting decisions, or whatever, you know, subsidy, whatever decisions are going to be made related to a project going forward, are going to be informed by that you know, broad base of support or opposition, but you've brought everyone into the room and invited everyone into the conversation. The final thing I'll say is that, you know, I think if a company is coming to advance a specific project and sees that as the start of the conversation, I think in a lot of cases what's happening is they're fast forwarding through the most important conversation, which is the kind of conversation that, you know, I and my colleagues were speaking to earlier, where you bring folks together in the community, and without a specific project on the table, maybe not even a specific technology on the table, talk about, you know, what the future of the community should look like to address local needs. And you know, if it's a great project, it's probably going to fit within that framework. But the conversation is already there, and it's not a conversation that is convened by a project developer. The deep work has been done beforehand.
Great. We have probably time for one long question or 2 short ones. So Farai and then Lauren, I think.
Thank you very much. Very lively panel. I wanted to ask about whether we have some best practices in terms of free, prior, informed consent. We hear about this term, but the practicality of it is difficult. And the other question is on democracy. Where I come from, elections are more of a mini civil war, where the people have no voice. Should we expect the same communities suddenly to be consulted meaningfully when it comes to a project? When it comes to elections, they are beaten, they're traumatized, they have no access even sometimes to information about elections. They live in isolated villages, and the politicians only know where they live when they want to bring a ballot box. But no medicine, no roads, nothing like that. So do we think consultation can work in an environment where democracy is in an intensive care unit? Thank you.
It's well put. Who wants to tackle that?
Farai, look, my sense is that we need a total restructuring of our societies. As you know, in most of our countries, mining is captured by the elite in collusion with external either companies in industrial mining or artisanal mining with some syndicate. As you know, we don't talk much here about artisanal mining. It's one of the problematic sector that is posing serious challenges. So you can't delink the way mining is done with the political problem we are facing. You'll see that you take the case of certain countries. There are some certain countries you can see some progress. Namibia, you can see that you have a more relatively well-governed and a responsible government. You have Botswana, where you can see that even in these two countries, you find that civil society is quite weak, but the government performs its duties to attend to people's needs. But even where there are problems, they are not as to the extent that we face in Congo, in Zimbabwe, and in some other countries. So you go to which other country that can be, look really increasingly Senegal, but with a bit problems, with new discoveries and so on. We are seeing a more progressive government in place. But when it remains to, including Ghana, I don't think Ghana is a good example. Yeah. The gold mines has been the most destructive sector in Ghana. But I'm simply saying, I think it's the relationship between democracy and what is happening, or politics and mining. They're so intertwined that it's so difficult to take them apart. On free, prior, and informed consent, it comes back to this. I think the only place where we are seeing a bit of progress in Latin America, with the free, prior, and informed consent, where there's a bigger progress in some cases, but in the context of the African continent, it's a struggle. The Kolobeni example is a fascinating one, where the community forced to be listened to, not be given the opportunity, but it forced itself, it fought, and it won. We've got there aren't many cases where a community have won such a battle.
I think that's time for us. I want to thank you all, our panelists, for having such an informed discussion today. I learned a lot. I hope you all did too. And we can continue the discussion. I think we're at break now, so over coffee. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.